be talking about the Philippine historiography. And in this topic, you will learn the trends of Philippine historiography. First, you will get to know what historiography is and its development in the country from the colonial period up to the contemporary era. So lastly, we shall talk about the different sources of Philippine history. But before anything else, let me just present to you the learning outcomes of the topic. So at the end of this lesson, you are expected to first name and be familiar with the works of foreign and local Philippine historiographers, and then trace the development of Philippine historiography and the changes it underwent in terms of style and perspective. So now, let me just ask you, what do you think are the documents that were written that would describe the life and culture of our ancestors during the pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial periods of our Philippine history? So these are the things that we are going to try to answer and see in this lesson. So Philippine historiography can be mainly traced back during the Spanish period. It comprises the historical and archival research and writing on the history of the archipelago throughout Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. And as discussed in the previous lesson, historiography is an analysis, selection of genuine sources, and the composition of the same as a narrative that the writing of history can be made again. So, diba, in the last lesson, I presented to you a diagram on how a historian come up with a specific information about the history through the process called historiography. Okay, so now, in addition, under Philippine historiography, Filipino historians are constrained to view Philippine history from the standpoint of the Filipinos. In fact, as early as the 1960s, our historians have devoted to expanding the foundations of their historical sources and provided new and fresh interpretations that defied the traditional discourses in history. So generally, Philippine historiography can be divided into three periods. So we will be talking about the pre-colonial era or period, the colonial period, the post-colonial period. But for now, we will be focusing on the pre-colonial period, or before the coming of the Spaniards, since the Spaniards were the first ones who colonized the Philippines. Okay, so in pre-colonial period, this covers the prehistory of the Philippine archipelago and its inhabitants. There are only limited information during this era, and this is probably because almost all records did not survive, and most of the writings were written on perishable materials such as bamboo or leaves, wherein they were not saved, or they did not survive, and hence the first and only written document found in the early Philippine language as of the moment is called the Laguna copper plate or copper inscription, or LCI, in 900 CE. Okay, so here, wait, this is it. This is the Laguna copper plate. So before the LCI, most of the earliest Philippine histories were written by Westerners such as Antonio Pigafetta and Maximiliano Transilvanos. So Pigafetta was a chronicler who was was with Magellan during his voyage to the Philippines. And his chronicles included profound ethnographic details on the culture of the early Filipinos. So his accounts were actually valuable because of the first-hand information on Philippine culture before the Spanish contact. So Pigafetta was not a Spaniard. He was hired by the King of Spain during that time. He was actually Italian, and his main job was actually to chronicle, to write everything that happened during the whole expedition. Another reason that there are only limited information during the pre-colonial period could be the probability will be because when talking about Philippine history, we often talk about the Spanish era. And most of us forget about the period before the coming of the Spaniards, or before the American era, or before the coming of the Japanese people and the World War II. So rarely anyone talks about pre-colonial period in the Philippines. So in this part of the lesson, we will take a look of what was like for Filipinos before the Spaniards came. People often think that the pre-colonial period people as barbaric tribe and cavemen, but in reality, we had good culture back then. So some proofs here. First, let's start with the government. So Filipinos back then had higher standard in government. We had someone called the Datu, which was basically a tribe chief and usually served his or her people well. And unlike Spanish rulers, a datu can be legally impeached by normal people. A woman can also be a datu, and you see, even the term used was gender neutral. It can be anybody, including gender fluid people like the binabaylan, the binabae, the asogs, and the bayugins. Also, to your surprise, we had a justice system back then. It may not be as complicated as the justice system now, and it may be a bit inhumane compared to the justice system that we have right now, but it worked for them back then. Okay, so next is the life and culture of our ancestors. Back then, when we were self-sufficient, in terms of food and other resources. So this is contrary to popular belief that we are always starving during those times, because we also had farming people, or our ancestors already knew farming, and one notable farms we had during the pre-colonial period that up to this day is still there is the Banawi rice terraces located north of the country. And just to make it clear, Magellan did not discover the Philippines. So in fact, way before he came to our shores in 1521, we were already trading with Japan and China several years before he discovered the Philippines. So basically, again, contrary to popular belief about the Filipinos being jungle-living savages during the pre-colonial times, because in reality, Philippines during the pre-colonial days had a very advanced culture. So it can be seen in the in the fabrics that we had during that time, and in the other. So basically, anything that is contradictory to Spanish culture was considered barbaric. Okay, so the pre-colonial period finally came to an end when the Philippines was discovered or rediscovered in the year 1521 and colonized on the year 1565. So the Spaniards started westernizing the Filipinos by introducing Christianity, and traditional Filipino culture started to be replaced with Western culture. Okay. So aside from the Laguna copper plate, there are also books or accounts written by Spanish historians or chroniclers who are mostly friars. So many other works were about the activities and missionaries or missions of various religious orders delegated in the Philippines. So their accounts are quite noteworthy for our history, since these missionaries brought Christianity or Catholicism in the country. So their reports are vital because of the records of the establishment of many towns, although most of the time, the natives were responsible for founding the latter, or the towns, before. Okay, so for example, the Order of St. Francis was active since the 14th century in Manila, the Tagalog provinces, Camarines, and other regions. So the Franciscan Juan de Plasencia, here he is, was requested by Governor de Sande to provide piece of information about the government, administration of justice, inheritances, slaves, dowries, worship, burials, and superstition of the colony. So as a response, he wrote the book Los Costumbres de los Tagalos, or The Customs of the Tagalogs. So the book identifies the political, social, economic, and cultural systems that were already in place among Filipino communities prior to the arrival of the Spaniards. So he was dedicated to lead a lifestyle devoid of luxury and to be in constant contact with people he wanted to convert to Christianity, because as a priest, it was his primary job. So he wanted people to easily understand the Catholic Church for them to willingly accept the Catholic faith. As such, he was honored by the Franciscan order with the title Venerable, and he died in Liliw, Laguna in 1590. So, actually, Filipinos were allowed to hold the position of Gobernadorcillo of pueblos during that time, and friars assigned in the parishes performed administrative duties in the local level by supervising and monitoring the activities of the gobernadorcillo. What Juan de Plasencia did. Okay, so the friars became the most influential and knowledgeable figure in the pueblo. So some duties of friars were to periodically inform their superiors of what was happening in their respective parishes, and to report the number of their converts, the people's practices, their socio-economic situations, and the problems they encountered. So the Spaniards back then were not that bad at all. Okay, so short letters were submitted by some friars, while those who were good observers and gifted in writing wrote longer dispatches. And ininangani, Juan de Plasencia, he has written this book, and it is an example of the work of a priest before. So it contains extensive information reconstructing the political and sociocultural history of the Tagalog region. So his work is a primary source, or considered to be a primary source, because it is a first-hand account of his experiences and observations. So as what I've mentioned a while ago, that was his tactics to persuade the people, or the Tagalog people back then, in converting to Christians or to Christianity, to resorting to Christianity. Iya ginsasangkay or befriend, and then he kept on asking about the lives of the people before the coming of the Spaniards. So the work of Plasencia is considered by many historians as an example of a friar account. So the original text of Plasencia's Customs of the Tagalogs is currently kept in Archivo General de Indias in Seville, Spain. And there's also a duplicate copy in the Archivo Franciscano Ibero-Oriental in Madrid, Spain. And in the Philippines, there is an English version that appeared in Volume 7 of Blair and Robertson's collection of Spanish documents. So another English translation was published as part of the volume for Pre-Hispanic Philippines of the Filipiniana Book Guild series. Okay, so aside from Juan de Plasencia, other friars and colonial officials who wrote about the Philippines during the early Spanish colonial period included Miguel Delawarca. So Captain Miguel Delawarca arrived in the Philippines in 1576, and he became an encomendero of Panay. So if you are familiar with the term encomendero, they meant to be tax collectors. So the first Philippine-Spanish government general, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, gave Delawarca a swath of land in Oton, Iloilo in June 1572. So that was 1 year after the establishment of the Spanish government in Manila. So Loarca was different from the other soldiers, explorers, and friars who like to amass wealth for themselves so that they can live an affluent life when they return to Spain and Mexico or anywhere they want. So these are some of the characteristics of the Spaniards before, and mga medyo magraot ng mga klasihin Spaniards, which actually resembles mga characteristics of some of politicians in the Philippines nowadays. Okay, so kidding aside, unlike his cohorts, he did not scold and label the natives evil for worshipping duatas and anitos. He was fond of the Philippines, even though he knew that it is not popular as other places. So probably he was fascinated with the culture of the Filipinos way before the Spaniards came. So his admiration for the Visayan people made him study the Visayan culture, languages, and even geography, which led him to writing the book The Relación de Islas Filipinas, which emphasized the material culture, of the early Filipinos, which he considered as innovative. And as an encomendero, he made a portrayal of the economic living of the native Filipinos. However, unlike other encomenderos who abused their power, Luarca only collected taxes from the husbands and bachelors in his area. So another one is the book of Antonio de Morga. So among the Spanish officials appointed in the Philippines, Dr. Antonio de Morga was one of the most admired. So his Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas is one of the most reliable sources of information regarding the Philippines in the 16th century. So Rizal even attempted to annotate this book in his search for unbiased historical truth about the country, because Rizal that time thought that there are some misinterpretations about the Filipinos, so that's why he tried to annotate Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. Okay, so many of what Filipinos know about Philippine history during the first century of the Spanish period were derived from the accounts of the Spanish friars and colonial officials, because these are the only sources that we had, or until now we have. Okay, so however, there are proofs that can actually be used that even before the Spaniards came to the Philippines, the pre-colonial Filipinos were already established in terms of government, culture, livelihood, and others. So when the Spaniards came, nagkamay dalahin shift of culture, because they've already introduced the westernized culture to the Western culture to the Philippines. Okay, so